Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the introductions. So for today's discussion, before we start, I want to share a couple of words about the grid. The grid plays a crucial role in meeting the demand of our society for clean, affordable, and reliable energy. But its role in our energy system is changing in fundamental ways in light of security, sustainability, and price instability challenges, among others, just to list a few. Over the next decades, we will expect that the lines will continue to blur among the industry, traditional companies, emerging players, as well as adjacent industries like mobility and also the manufacturing sector. Tomorrow will be more complex, less linear, and definitely more interconnected. At the same time, shifting policy, geopolitical uncertainties, and technological advances will remain as mega forces shaping the path forward. Big investments will be required. PwC estimates that just in Europe alone, ahead of 2050, about $2 trillion will be required in terms of modernizing the grid. But the importance of the grid is not in question. The question we will try to answer today with this fantastic group of panelists is what are the technological solutions which are needed for smooth functioning of a better integrated grid. Thanks, and welcome everyone. Before we start with some deeper dive into the discussions, we'd like to hear from each of the panelists about the areas that you're working on in terms of the energy space, what technologies excite you, and what technological solutions do you think we should be scaling up in the short term, mid or long term, so that we can develop a better interconnected grid. And why don't we start from here, Fredrika?
Yeah. Does this work? Yeah, it works. Thanks a lot, José. So I'm Fredrika. I work at Verdane, which is a growth investment firm based here in Europe. We invest in digitalization and decarbonization. And specifically within decarbonization, we invest in both renewable energy, electrification, and not the least in grid stability and technologies that can help the grid become more stable. And in terms of what we see as interesting here, it's very much related to both what you said, José, and also what Simona's just discussed, that there are a lot of different challenges that the grid is facing going forward. And I think making sure that you have technologies available that can relieve this and that can make it possible to go through the net zero scenario, that's something that really excites us.
Fantastic. Terhi?
So my name is Terhi Vapola, and I'm a managing partner of Greencode Ventures. So we are investing exactly into this field. So we're looking at green transition, and we are especially interested in solutions related to digitalizing that. We believe that digitalization is underutilized resource in solving many of these issues what we are dealing with. So if you're thinking of adding the whole sheer amount of renewables we need to add into the system, and all this what we've heard today, so balancing out things, optimizing them, and making most use of those assets which are very intermittent is super important, and that's especially what we are interested in.
Brilliant. Myles?
Very good. Good afternoon. Thanks, José. My name's Myles Margot, representing Siemens Energy. The three main components, I think, from our side is really about digitalization, decarbonization, and resilience. And when I talk about those three things, when I talk about digitalization and making it technical, it's not just a asset digitalization, so the transformer, the circuit breaker. It can be the solution, the substation, the network, and obviously the power plant. So there's a lot of equipment out there. It is connected, or it can be connected, and how do we do that? From a decarbonization perspective, it's about existing technologies that we have, like HVDC, new technologies, but it's not just prioritizing that in the large scale, also in the MV networks, MV, DC plus, these type of things. And then resilience. Again, I go back to, you can have resilient components. So how do you make the transformer more resilient? How do you make the substation more resilient, the network, the power plants? And for me, the priority is decarbonization, because that's the one that touches all of us, from a company, corporate organization, from an individual perspective. So I think that's one that is really interconnected for us.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I believe that we will also have the chance to have some deeper dives in terms of the digital aspects. But why don't we take first, let's say, a higher level view? And given the Siemens experience working across the globe, Myles, can you please talk about, from Siemens, your perspective, why is it important to develop a better interconnected grid? And how do you see this happening across regions? What are the challenges? Which regions are, let's say, pushing forward or more aggressively in these regards?
So I see it in two main aspects. One is stability, and that links back to what I mentioned earlier about resilience. It's one element. And the second is availability. So without stability, then availability becomes very difficult. There are other influences, macroeconomic, geopolitical, energy mix. We have sun today, no sun tomorrow. So all of these things impact the stability and availability. If we talk about different regions, and I think that's a very important part, because we met Christoph in the earlier panel, they discussed it quite extensively. And you see how many countries, many regions, it's a legacy topic. They have a certain infrastructure, a certain way in how they produce power, distributed it, and how they manage that. And that can be completely different to the neighbor. So I do think the solutions vary between regions, but I think what's very important is learning from one another, and not necessarily reinventing the same wheel at times. So that's why these type of events are very important, because OEMs, customers, everyone gets together and discusses these solutions.
Brilliant. And before we go further, actually would like to get some sense of the audience in here. Can you please raise your hand if you are in the investment side? Okay, that's a good amount of audience. Corporate side? Okay. Startups? Okay, fantastic. So we have plenty of innovators in here. We'll appreciate also if, when you're sharing from your perspective, you can consider that we have here lots of investors. We also have 2 investors here in the panel. And why don't we go with you next, Terhi? You're a seasoned investor. You have invested in different early stage startups and spin-offs. So I believe probably many different lessons learned in terms of success, failures. In this particular area, what are some of the insights that you can share for the audience?
I think this topic, what we are discussing here, so looking at the grid, so either we talk about the global level or interconnectedness of the regions, or we go into TSO or DSO level. So looking at the market as such, so we all know that this is the area which is needing a lot of investment, so that it needs to be renewed in a way that it can handle the distributed architectures which we are going into, and also the mix of renewables, especially added. So looking at like a global interconnection, so if it's windy, it's most likely windy in the whole east coast of certain country, but in the other market, it might not be. So how do we make that, as you talk about this stabilizing effect in a broader sense? What is very hard in this area, in the investment perspective, is that we are talking about very big assets. So the higher you go from like a microgrids to DSOs or TSOs, global level or regional level, the complexity and the slowness in practice increases. So looking at, for example, just an example out of the US, so looking at grid interconnection, so getting the connection into the grid, solar parks, renewables. we basically have double the capacity of energy which is waiting to be connected. So think about that. And the majority of that, I think 95% of that is renewables. So really having a major impact. And then if you look at the timing to get into the connection, so going from the 2000 to 2010, it took average 2 years. So now it's like 4 years to get into connection. So because of the fact that grid cannot handle the load and maybe it's not optimized. So I think that innovation-wise, finding solutions to kind of overcome that. So looking at, for example, which sites should we look at so that you can optimize, you put your development project into the area which is likely to get connected easily, or you look at the optimization of the grid. So when knowing that the grid is, how would I say, not that strong, maybe is the right way. So then looking at managing that load and also planning that interconnection. So those are the areas. But as an investor, I think the hardest part there, obviously, is the slowness of the process. So even if you have a technology which is really taking the whole development further and solving some of those challenges, even if you consider that it's super important for your customer, say DSO or TSO, the sheer process of planning and getting that in takes a long time. So I think that probably is the biggest challenge investing in this space, how to kind of get your customers. And then, of course, one thing, piece of advice to kind of look at, so who is your customer? Is it the utility, or is it actually somebody working in this space which solves some of the issues like we heard today? So those are my views.
Fascinating. And also, landscape is changing, right? For instance, a couple of months ago, the International Energy Agency published a report looking how they will expect that in the next 5 years, installment of renewables will be about the same or more as in the last 20. Fredrika, do you have any views in terms of that? Similar views in terms of challenges, or do you have any examples from the companies that you're investing? I'm aware that Verdane Capital has committed about 4 billion euros across different offices in Europe. Any solution that you can share with us?
Yeah, happy to share that. And I can actually take one example of a portfolio company of ours that's called CleanWatts and are actually here today. So make sure to go down to the exhibition hall and meet them. But what CleanWatts does is that they make sure that one of the main challenges of the pressures on the grid is solved by having like the transmission grids are the ones facing the most loads and biggest needs for upgrades. And CleanWatts makes sure that you create local energy communities instead, where you have production and consumption within the same local area. So what they do is that they make sure that you put up renewable energy systems, mainly PV, in a neighborhood, making sure that it's optimally placed, and then sharing that energy with businesses and consumers in the similar area, and also having then a software to manage these energy loads. So that's, for example, one of the different things that we're looking at, and I think it's a super interesting case. And I think they have a lot of good insights. So yeah, once again, make sure to check out their exhibition downstairs.
Okay, so that's a good takeaway, to go check the exhibition booth. And maybe Myles, from your perspective, since this area actually also involves a lot on collaboration between the innovator, more established players. I understand that you're working also in the space of partnerships. Do you have any views in terms of how the landscape looks at the moment?
Yeah, and maybe to link to some of the points from this discussion and also the panel before. And that is about, let's say, the end-to-end process. So we are OEM, we can manufacture the product. We manufacture the product for our customer, who also has then customers. So what I mean by this is that we have to all talk together, and the real fundamental is the let's say the regulative or policy framework, where they set the rules, our customers then have to abide and then write specifications of which OEMs like us then, try to supply product or solutions for that. There's the in-between where we come up with disruptive technologies or solutions that can support, so it's not just a one-way traffic. But the real important part is I'm almost going to say that whole regulatory framework, Net Zero Industrial Act, EU taxonomy, all these type of things. And why that's so important is because, and I can make an example of transformers. We tried to discuss life cycle assessments for transformers in 2018, 2019 as an international community. And we parked it as an international community because it wasn't important at the time. Circuit breakers, on the other hand, is so much more developed in terms of life cycle assessments and these type of things. If you take the F-gas regulation, that is a fundamental change driven by policymakers. And that's where us, Siemens Energy, and I think many of our partners, and I'm going to say partners, I mean that as in customers, competitors, everyone, is to sit down, discuss how do we create the rules, the environment to enable these things in a fair and economical way. I think that's very important.
And that's very fascinating, especially the regulatory part, like how that should be leveling up the playing field. Do any of you have any perspectives right now on the recently announced EU Net Zero Industry Act and the Green Industrial Plan? Do you see something from the areas that you're working on?
Maybe I can just continue on that. And that's a really nice example where Siemens Energy and a group of us, we really, went back to the European Commission to bring in grid technologies. Because in the Act, there was a number of topics around availability of PV panels, availability of this. And we felt the need to bring in the topic of grid technologies. So the things like transformers, circuit breakers, all the equipment needed to facilitate a lot of this. We can't build a renewable plant without a transformer or a circuit breaker. And I'd say it's been very positive to see that now it's incorporated. Yes, there's a few things to go through, but and that's what I mean by the open discussion. And I think that's a nice example where, as a team, we've managed to bring something and actually help develop it further.
And perhaps adding to that also another key part of this new proposal is also related to the permitting times that you mentioned, Terhi. And that's also going to be something that's really interesting to see where we end up going forward. But I think it's a great initiative, and I think it's great that we put this on the agenda. And now it's just making sure that we implement it as well.
Do you have any views on the regulatory aspect, Terhi?
I think the intent is super good. The question, of course, which if we need to have a little bit of debate also. So thinking of how it really supports the innovation. So the ideas behind it is good, but what does it create? Does it create like a situation where, for example, startups or companies, especially industrial players from the bigger countries, have an advantage over some of the smaller countries? So that kind of things, of course, we don't want. We want this to be one market and supporting, of course, Europe as a whole to take it forward, and especially, of course, for us, interesting is to see what it can bring into the startups. So can we can it really help us to deliver that so intent is good, but can we deliver the innovativeness of Europe? So I think we probably will need even further in order to take us forward, but it's a very good start.
And to that, perhaps I think we're all clear on the intention of this, but then there comes a bit more of a philosophical question of should you do the carrot or the stick method, and how does that affect the energy transition landscape in Europe? And I don't think any one of us have a clear answer on that, but it's something that's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out.
And if I may put an example to what you just said, Terhi, take the F-gas regulation. That's a nice example of many OEMs, many customers had a different philosophy or approach to this topic of installation gases, whether it was SF6, clean air, flue nitriles, whatever it may be. And we had customer focus or preference, and we had OEM preference. And it's only in the recent 2-3 years, I would say, with such a high pressure, they say demand creates innovation, but pressure creates action sometimes. And it's about discussing that it's not about making one more advantageous for the other, but how do we as a community, again, going back to the topic of customer, OEMs, suppliers, how do we work together and find the best fit, most economical and sustainable?
And in the area of impact assessment, especially I think this question for the investors, I understand that you also have some impact funds. How are you measuring the green impact of your investments or the decarbonization potential?
So we both are actually having a fund which is focusing on SFDR 9, so dark green. So from our perspective, and I'm sure that you explain yours, but from our perspective, we are especially interested in product market impact. And therefore, rather the impact which happens in real life than the impact which is in like CO2 reduction potential in 2020, 50, whatever. So what you can do now, because we all know that we are already in borrowed time, so thinking of this whole perspective of global warming, and we should be staying, we said, 1.5 degrees, and it almost starts to be impossible. But it all boils down to making the impact happen basically within this decade. So for us, that is the core of looking at the impact. So looking at what happens in the product market, what happens in real life, but then also understanding that we are dealing with how would you say, systemic problem. So if you're dealing with systemic problem, many times it's easy to say that, okay, we look at a CO2 reduction and that's just that, marketing-wise, simple. But in the real life, as we are discussing here, so you need infrastructure impact, you need to look at also the impact of something like software. So it would be like naive to say that software doesn't have negative impact. Of course it does, it works on something. So then looking at this whole value chain and looking at different parameters, then assessing all those parameters, and then basically from our perspective, investment-wise, we are just basically looking at the shades of gray, summing those all together, so measuring all of them, and then seeing which side, is it positive impact or is it negative impact? And then basically that makes our framework of how we approach the impact assessment in our case.
And I think at Verdane it's quite similar actually. So we also think about how does the solution contribute and what additional contribution does this solution make to our world? And what we look at is that we also look at, as the business scales, we also want to see that the impact of the business scales, and that's a clear line. And then in general, I think it's quite a lot of different types of industries, and there's a difficulty in finding one exact measurement on how to measure all different kinds of businesses. But how we've chosen to look at it is in terms of finding separate things for each and every business on how you can measure it, but then also converting it to some kind of common impact score. So yeah.
And if I may contribute, and that's where from an OEM perspective it becomes very interesting, because these measurements, evaluations, ultimately have to also be brought down to a component level. And that's where we're really trying to push, and I must say with our partners, customers, other OEMs, about how do you measure life cycle assessments for the different products, environmental product declarations, what's your reference point, how do you evaluate it at a product level, at a substation solution level, and how that all then feeds up to our customer who's looking for a green bond or green financing of some sort. So it's everyone's interlinked in supporting that.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, and it's also fascinating the aspect of how to compare deep tech with, let's say, digital solutions, right? Because we cannot put them essentially in the same bucket. And just for instance, let's say at PwC, we have been conducting research looking at the state of climate tech. And we have seen that in the last couple of years, more than 1/4 of every dollar invested in VC is going to a climate tech startup. So we're seeing like that positive rise. But there's still like a lot of focus on, let's say, digital solutions, AI. I wonder if you have any views on that, perhaps Terhi or Fredrika, in terms of how do you see the attractiveness, investment potential? And before, please feel free to answer. And also would like to ask the audience that if you have 1 or 2 questions, we have some time for that. So we can move on that afterwards.
Yeah, no, but I think I fully agree with you that it's not possible to decarbonize a society only by looking at software, because you actually need the hardware there as well. And that's something that we acknowledge, and something that so at Verdane we're looking at both the hardware and the software side, but we're looking at our main criteria is more that it needs to be a solution for the decarbonization.
I would actually say that in climate tech, if you kind of assume that it's rooting from the old clean tech investment, I would say that hardware is actually maturity. And if I remember right, I was looking at a study where it says that, was it even 95% of this segment's investments go into hardware? So actually, if you are on the software side, on top of the infrastructure, is actually minority still. It looks different, of course, if you look at it from the broader VC ecosystem perspective, but if you kind of narrow it down into our substance matter expertise, what we are dealing here. So I think the obvious answer is that we need both. We need all hands on deck, and we need solutions which can be built on top of the existing infrastructure. And there, of course, software has a major play, so that you can scale it fast, build on top of the existing wind farms, build on top of existing solar, build on top of optimizing the grid. So all of these. But of course, it's quite obvious that we as clean tech and climate tech investors, we need to also have a short and long-term view, and we need to tackle that. And I think also from the investment perspective, since the climate tech is becoming a little bit on woke as well, so that will of course drive more, how would I say, segmentation also. So soon we start to talk about climate tech generalists and climate tech specialists who take certain path of that. And since we need to create so much new solutions into the market, all of that specialization which helps the startups in that special area to succeed is obviously very much needed.
Brilliant. And any questions from the audience? I think we can take one question.
Anyone would like to
ask
a question? No?
No questions? Well, then probably just to close the session, I'd like to ask each of you if you could please share from your perspective what excites you in this space in the next year or two. It could be a trend, it could be a development, a technology, something that will upscale. Why don't we start from Fredrika?
And perform this formidable task in less than 2 minutes, please.
Yes, 30 seconds each, please.
Okay, so I think that's quite a tricky question, actually, because there's so many things out there that excites me. And just walking downstairs here, meeting different companies, there's so many new different technologies and solutions. So I'm not sure if I have one answer to it.
No.
But in general, I think how we deal with different flexibility solutions related to the grid is something that I'm looking closely at and think is super exciting.
Okay, great. Terhi?
I think one of the interesting areas in the grid area, so if you talk about smart grid, and then also solutions related to what we discussed today, so interconnectedness into the grid, so solutions related to that, so what sites to look at, for example, what technologies you could use for that kind of things.
Yeah. Myles?
I'll keep it short. Something I say, or my 6-year-old says to me, teamwork makes the dream work. So if I leave it on that, where we all have to work together, we all have strengths, and the more openly we discuss and work together on these regulatory topics, specification, customer demands, whatever it may be, technologies, disruptive or not, teamwork makes the dream work.
Fantastic.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for the discussion. And Fredrika, what's the name of the booth that we need to visit afterwards?
Cleanwhat's.
Okay.
And I actually have 8 different colleagues here at the fair today, so make sure to grab someone from Verdane.
Okay, and then if you recommend any other booth, like, we will be there as well.
We've got a great team from our venture capital team, and also ourselves from a technology perspective.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.